Good to be with you this morning. Thank you for your presence and for your kind attention these past few days. Because I'm so insecure in who I am, I need to justify why we were late. And we were on our way on the highway, and we saw a bunch of brake lights, so we decided to exit the highway. And we saw a bunch of brake lights there, and then I didn't know what to do because I'm not from here. So if I was in Dallas, I would have known how to put it in four-wheel drive and get off the road and drive in the dirt. But in San Antonio, I didn't know how, so we just decided to follow our hearts for about 10 minutes, and then we got back on track. So that's why we were late, and I'm thankful that you all would tarry for us. Now, we've been doing a series of studies on mental health and the balance of having a healthy mind, but also a healthy form of spirituality. And what I've tried to do is take two extremes, who may be those who are suspicious about mental health, and then those who find their full identity in some sort of diagnosis that they've been given. And what we want to do is take those and take the legitimate issues that they might have, but also help overcome some of the stigmatization or maybe the lack of awareness that the other views might have, and try to find that balance. Now, that said, this morning I want to hit the pause button on the series, and we're going to pick it back up this afternoon when we talk about Jesus as the wonderful counselor. Until then, I simply wish to help prepare our minds for the table, and I would like to share with you a Bible study from the four Gospels called In His Own Words. And so another title might be The Red Letters, right? And so as we look at the words of Jesus in the four Gospels leading up to his death, burial, and resurrection, I think you'll find it a very fascinating study. It's definitely helpful to prepare our minds for the table. So I'd like to first show you this graphic. And by the way, if you'd like to have this sermon, you can scan that QR code. It takes you to a folder with all the sermons that I've been putting in the recent months. And this one's called In His Own Words. And you can follow along, or you could have it for later study if I move too quickly. Now, this is just the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're called synoptic because they were written around the same time, and they follow a very similar narrative. And even though they're from three different points of view, and you've got at least two that are eyewitnesses and one Luke, who interviewed people who were eyewitnesses, what's really interesting is how their verses overlap. There is a lot of these books that say the exact same thing. And there's some of it that's unique to each book, and that doesn't mean that they're telling a different story. It just means, as an eyewitness, some of them saw different things. Some of them were privy to different things. But they definitely saw a lot of the same thing in common. What an interesting view when we look at all three. When we look at all four, when you include the Gospel of John, it tells the same story of Jesus, but John adds some additional insight, some additional teaching to it. He wrote his Gospel years afterwards, when people were starting to question things, to consider maybe an alternate view, and so he had to bring them back to the gospel truth by providing some insight about the nature of Jesus. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow a road map, and we're going to begin in the garden prayer, going through Jesus' arrest, the pre-dawn trial when he's before Pilate, on the way to Golgotha, on the cross, at the tomb, and then some final words. And what I'd like to simply do is share with you the scriptures of Jesus in his own words explaining what's going on, and that I'll provide maybe some commentary to fill us in the gaps in between each of these episodes. Now, this is not meant to be seen as a geographical map. So please don't think that Jesus was walking around like this in the Jerusalem area. This is simply a visual to show us as he moves from one location to the next. Now, I'll say this final point, and then we'll begin. There's four Gospels for a very good reason. Each Gospel is intended to show a different audience the Messiah. Matthew, for example, is written to a Jewish audience, and so it's very heavy in Old Testament scriptures to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. Whereas Luke was written to a Gentile audience, and it has a lot of parables and stories that are very unique and not mentioned anywhere else. So it's good that we have all four. So as I do this, trying to put them all together to share the same story, I might get it out of chronological order. Since I've given this sermon already, I've had somebody share with me what they thought was a better interpretation of one of these events, and I think they're right, so I changed it a little bit. So what I'm saying is, if you, after this study, believe that there's a better, more biblical way of how these events unfolded, I am very open to hearing from you. And I'd love to consider maybe how we could shift a little bit and show it more accurately. So please, I enjoy those comments, and I look forward to talking to you at lunch. Let's begin. Let's start in the garden prayer, shall we? Jesus has left the upper room. They have instituted the Lord's Supper, the final act that all 12 did together with Jesus. Or rather, I think it's the 11 at this point because Judas has already gone. But the final act that the group of apostles and their Lord did, you know what it was? They sang a hymn. I think that's important. There was value in the group singing together this hymn. And then they leave, and Jesus teaches them as they go out, and he's talking about how he's the vine and they're the branches and all these wonderful blessings, the high priestly prayer. And then after they go out, he continues his teaching. And they cross the brook Kidron into the garden, and Jesus tells his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And so he takes the three. If you were here last night, we know that Jesus had an outer group of safety called the 12, and then he had this inner group of safety called the three. And these three interacted with him in a very special way that's different even than the other apostles did. So the inner three and he move on a little bit further, and Jesus then says, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. And so Peter, James, and John, Jesus encourages them to stay there and pray with him. And then he steps a little bit farther so that he can pray by himself. Jesus offers up this prayer. He says, Abba, O my Father, all things are possible for you. If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And his first prayer that Jesus gives is the one that's probably the most vulnerable about how he's concerned, if we want to use words like anxious, nervous about what is about to unfold. He wants this cup to pass from him. What cup is that? If we understand the scriptures, it's the cup of God's wrath. When you read the Old Testament, many times this cup is given to nations, and they're told to drink from the cup of God's wrath, that God's wrath is pouring over. And so Jesus, taking on God's wrath, taking on the punishment, the suffering, he begs, please, if possible, let this cup pass from me. But in the same prayer of him wanting to give it up is also submission to God's will. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. He then returns to the three, and he says, Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Rise, watch, and pray that you do not fall into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. So I guess the three, and some people suggest, and I agree with them, that they weren't just lazy, right? They're not just tired, but they were so emotionally raw from all of the teaching that Jesus has given. They're in distress about how he says that he's going to die, that they are just crashing after that emotional experience. So Jesus rouses them, and then he goes off again to pray by himself, and he says, Oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. He returns to the three, finds them asleep again, leaves them alone, goes off to pray again a third time. It's not recorded. But he prays by himself a third time, and then he comes back, rouses his disciples, and says, Are you still sleeping and resting, it is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. And so the 12 rise with Jesus, and they look off into the distance, and there is a cohort of soldiers, temple guards, and religious leaders, and one of the disciples. When this group finally arrives in front of Jesus, he says, "Whom are you seeking?" The group responds, "Jesus of Nazareth." Now, this is one of those times where I don't necessarily understand what's happening. I'm going to do my best to explain it, but I'm definitely open to additional teaching and insight. When they say that they're seeking Jesus of Nazareth, he responds with, "I am he." And it says in the Gospel of John that they fall down before him. And scholars are divided on, is this miraculous? Did they simply get overwhelmed by Jesus' majesty and fall on their knees? Did something happen? Did it shake and they fell down because they trembled? Or is it simply that they're shocked that he would admit it so openly? Whatever the case may be, this cohort of soldiers falls down before him. They arise again, and he says, "Whom are you seeking?" And they reply, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way." And some suggest, and I agree with them, that Jesus has been very deliberate in identifying himself so that the disciples can get away, especially with what's about to happen. If you're familiar with the narrative, we know that Peter's already probably reaching for that sword at his side, and Jesus has taken the time to identify. He then turns to Judas and says, according to the Gospel of Matthew, "Friend, why have you come?" Now, Judas had already told the group there, "Whoever I kiss," and in their culture that would be some customary greeting of a smooch on the cheek, "Whoever I kiss, that is the one you are to arrest." And he hasn't done that yet. So the soldiers are still holding off, even though Jesus has identified himself. Right? I want you to, if you're a note taker, to maybe write down that in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus uses the word friend 3 times. And all 3 times, it's to somebody who's not a friend. And so it's an interesting observation that as he has very intense conversations with people who are trying to trick him, trap him, or arrest him, that he will call them a friend. That's just an extra bit of flavor, if you will. And so he says, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" as Judas steps forward to kiss him. And so the betrayal act takes place. He has been identified. The soldiers step forward to arrest him. And it's at this point that the Apostle Peter brings out his sword and slices off the ear of the high priest's servant, Malchus. Now, it is my interpretation that Peter, who was a fisherman and not a soldier, was not trying to cut off his ear. Now, while a fisherman would probably be really good with the knife and trying to gut a fish, I don't think he would be the best at taking the ear off a man on purpose. What do you think Peter was trying to do? It is my belief that he was trying to cut off his head. And he was going like this. And it was a broad stroke, and he ducked just in the right way where it glanced his ear clean off. Now, what do you think is going to happen if a Jew cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant who is with Roman soldiers? You know, this doesn't look good for Peter. How does he get off so easy? Well, because of what Jesus is about to do, but also because of what Jesus has already done. Jesus has already said, "I am he, let these go." He's trying to make sure that not everybody goes with him to the cross. He then rebukes Peter and says, "Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" I find that phrase interesting because he prayed about it. If there's no other way, please take this cup, but if there's no other way, your will be done. And now he's galvanized. He asks, "Shall I not drink the cup my Father's given me? Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen? Permit even this." Then, after rebuking Peter and healing the high priest's servant, so he's de-escalated that situation, they're here to arrest him and not the 11. He says to the crowd, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I sat daily with you, teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. So Jesus is bound, and likely he's not treated too well, and he is led to a pre-dawn trial. Now there are a few different events that happens here. He talks to Ananias, he talks to Caiaphas, and so there's a few different situations where he's brought before people. We're going to try to summarize them in one setting. Jesus talks to the group and says, I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet. And in secret I've said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I've said to them. Indeed, they know what I've said. Now this phrase is because the group is saying, are you the Christ? Tell us if you're the Christ. Tell us if you're the Christ. So he tells them this. I have taught these things publicly. I've not said anything in secret that you don't already know. As a result of Jesus saying this, one of those who is the guards and close to the high priest slaps him across the face or punches him, depending on what version you might read, and says, how dare you speak that way to the high priest? So he turns and says, have I spoken evil? Bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? And I think that probably caught that man off guard. I don't know, that none of us may know how to react if somebody were to strike us in the face. But Jesus, in this moment, calls out the man for what he did. He then, continuing to talk to this group who is pressing, tell us, are you the Christ? He says, if I tell you, you will by no means believe. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. So they bring forth witnesses trying to find people to corroborate something that says that he's a false teacher. And two finally come and say that this man said he would tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And so the high priest puts him under oath. I charge you, he says. Tell us, are you the Christ? And Jesus, quoting from the book of Daniel, says, you rightly say that I am. It is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. This is enough. The high priest symbolically tears his garment. He says, why do we have need of witnesses? See, you have heard the blasphemy yourselves. What should we do? And the response, he's worthy of death. The soldiers of the temple take Jesus, they blindfold him, they strike him, they spit on him, they taunt him. Prophesy to us now, Christ, who hit you? The Bible does not record that he says anything to them. Because of the way government works in this culture, they want him to be executed, but they need the government's approval. And that's Rome. And so they're now going to take Jesus to Pilate. And they will get Pilate to be the one to put the stamp on the death order. Now there is some interaction with Jesus and Pilate, and then Pilate sends him to Herod, but Jesus won't talk to him, and so he sends him back to Pilate. And I recognize that there may be a shift in scene, but now we're going to talk about his conversation with Pilate. Pilate asks him, are you indeed the king of the Jews? That's what they're saying, that you should die because you're the king of the Jews. Jesus says, it is as you say. I really like how he interacts with Pilate, because he gets Pilate to confess things. And then Jesus will simply respond, it's like you just said. He'll do that more than once. Pilate will continue to interrogate him, asking him if he's the king of the Jews. And so Jesus says, "Are you speaking for yourself about this? Or did others tell you this concerning me?" Which is frustrating to Pilate. Pilate is an interesting character. People have different views of his culpability in this. Was he somebody that his hand was forced? Did he really want to just get rid of Jesus? We really can't know. I have a view. I'll keep it for myself. I'd love to share it with you afterwards. But Pilate continues in this conversation with Jesus, and Jesus will eventually tell him, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate hears this and he says, "So you're a king then? You said you got a kingdom. You're a king?" And Jesus affirms it this way: "You rightly say I'm a king." See how he puts it back on Pilate? You're the one who said it. You said I was the king. And that's right. I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Now, Pilate's response is, what is truth? He's very frustrated. He goes out, and the different Gospels show us what happens next at a different part. So I'm kind of combining it into this specific section. The question is, why did Pilate have Jesus whipped if he was just going to kill him? Scholars scratch their heads about that. And what I think is a good option for why this happens in this particular way is that Pilate was actually trying to save his life. Hear me out. Pilate is going to have Jesus flogged, and so he does. The soldiers take Jesus inside this little courtyard and they tie him down, and then they whip him mercilessly with what is commonly called a cat of nine tails. And so you've got this leather rod that you're holding on to, and it's got different pieces of leather coming off of it that have bone and metal, glass, different instruments tied into it that are going to rip the flesh off of somebody's back. And Jesus' back is shredded. The soldiers, after he's been beaten, they put a crown of thorns on his head. They put a purple robe on him and put a reed in his hand. They mock worship him and bow down saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then they take the reed out of his hand and strike him again and again. It's at this point that Pilate brings Jesus out before the Jews and says, "Behold the man." In theory, what do you want me to do with this man? Look what Rome can do to your king. It's a power move. But also, in my opinion, this is Pilate's way to say, I have persecuted him, I have chastised him, now I can release him because he's innocent. What he didn't expect was that the Jews would be ready. They have already talked to the crowd, and now the crowd shouts out when Pilate says, "What do you want me to do with Jesus of Nazareth?" They reply, "Crucify him. Crucify him." Why? Pilate says. What crime has he committed? But they shouted even louder, "Crucify him." And so he takes this broken man, Jesus, back inside, and he says, "Do you not know that I have the power to save you? Will you not speak to me?" And Jesus, I find it very interesting that in this moment when he has been so physically destroyed, is still teaching. Ever the teacher says, "You could have no power at all against me unless it was given you from above. Therefore the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Still teaching about authority. The same way he did to the centurions, right? Well, Jesus leaves this place of trial. Pilate eventually gives in to their demands and orders that Jesus be crucified. And so on the way to Golgotha, Jesus will have a statement that he makes to the daughters of Jerusalem. Now, as I read this, I want us to maybe put it in context. Jesus starts out carrying his own cross, right? And so there's going to be a group of soldiers, and there's going to be Jesus. There's two other thieves that are going to be crucified with him. There's the religious leaders who no doubt are going out as well to watch him be crucified. But it says, rather he says, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Why does he say it that way? Well, many believe, myself included, I think we all believe, that social media wasn't around back then. Cell phones weren't around, so they couldn't text each other, hey, Jesus is getting crucified. This is the first time that many who believed in him figured out what was happening. And many in the city that were, quote unquote, pro-Jesus have now stepped out to see him walking down the road with the cross and with soldiers surrounding him. And so they weep. They cry out. And Jesus, ever the teacher, teaches them. He says, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts which never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? What in the world is he saying? Why is he teaching that? I will simply ask you to study Matthew 24 and scriptures like that talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he's teaching them, you think it's bad for me, you wait till it's your turn. And in AD 70, when Rome comes, it's going to be awful. Ever the teacher, he's still teaching. Jesus is led to Golgotha. And when Jesus is on the way, he's unable to finish this walk with the cross. And so a man from Cyrene named Simon is pressed into service by the soldiers, and this man carries the cross the rest of the way for Jesus. And when they get to this hill, they put the cross base on the ground, they stretch his arms out on the cross, and then the soldiers nail him to it. Jesus will say 7 things on the cross, and these 7 things deserve their own sermon. A lot could be said about them. But ever the teacher, the first 3 are others focused. So let's consider the message. As he's being crucified, in the Gospel of Luke, it records Jesus saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. He's interested in others and not simply in the pain that he's going through. After Jesus is lifted up, he calls out, who knows where in the crowd. A lot of us assume that they're in the back and then they're called to the front. But there's a group of women that are there that have followed Jesus. And only one of the disciples, the Apostle John, is there. And Jesus calls John and his earthly mother, Mary, to the cross and says, Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. And John will go on to talk about how from that day onward, he brought her into his home and took care of her. Ever the teacher, Jesus is instructing his followers, you need to take care of each other. While Jesus is hanging on the cross and the other 2, or the thieves are there with him, people are mocking him, they're blaspheming him, and both of the thieves do so as well. I find it interesting, especially in light of what we've been talking about the past few nights, about being insecure. You want to talk about insecure? If you're being crucified to death, and yet you want just a little bit of maybe the assurance, the laughter of the crowd, you want to feel that high one more time by making fun of somebody else who's being crucified. That's what they're doing. And maybe it's that your hope is that I'll make fun of him and maybe they'll give me a drink of water. If I make fun of him enough, maybe they'll end my suffering. But both of them are making fun of Jesus, and then one eventually comes to his senses and rebukes the other and says, we're getting what we deserve. This man doesn't deserve this. This is the Jonathan Edwards translation. Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. To which Jesus says, assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Now, at some point in this experience, Jesus' body starts to shut down. And he has been through so much suffering that it's time for him to say a few things to end his life and to wrap up this covenant that he is dying for. He calls out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And as he is the sin sacrifice on the cross, and as the Father steps away from the sin sacrifice, he cries out this phrase from the Psalm 22. His body reaches its end. He calls out, I thirst, and they give him something to drink. In the Gospel of John, he declares, it is finished, talking about the covenant. Everything has been accomplished. It's time. And so he declares finally, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, and Jesus dies. Now there are things that happen from the cross to the tomb. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who were two wealthy followers, who at one point had been afraid of the Jewish leaders, and so they had not followed him quite as openly, found their conviction. And it says that they, and the women who were at the cross, got the body down. They wrapped the body. Joseph had a carved tomb in rock. This is a very expensive place to be buried. He's honoring the body of Jesus greatly by putting it there. Nicodemus brought something like 75 pounds of spices for the body. And they gently and gingerly and honorably wrap the body of Jesus and place it in the tomb. A big stone is rolled in front of it, and the Roman guards put a seal on it. And that means that this is in there and is not to be broken. The Jews ask that Pilate puts guards at this tomb because they're worried that somebody's going to come and steal the body. And then everybody goes their way. It's the Sabbath, and so they rest. On the third day, early Sunday morning, the women who had ministered to him so faithfully have a plan that they need to do more. They want to offer more of these burial items to Jesus. So they're going to go and they're going to wrap the body with more perfumes, right? I love about them that they didn't know how they were going to roll the stone away, but that didn't stop them from preparing to go, right? Like they still had the plan. So it's like, you get this and I'll get this, and let's walk out there and we'll figure out how we're going to move that rock. We'll figure out what we'll tell the soldiers. That's faith. I don't know how we're going to do it, but let's do it. That's faith. The women arrive at the tomb, and it says the soldiers look like dead men. They're shocked. And the women are shocked because there's angels, 2 of them. One speaks. That's why some Gospels record 1 angel, and the others record that 2 are present. But the angel speaks to them and says, do not fear. We talked about that a few nights ago. This is sudden fear. That's why the soldiers shake like dead men, because they are afraid. The women are afraid, and the angel says, do not fear. And the soldiers have an ungodly response. They run off and tell a lie. And the women have a godly response. They run off and tell the truth. Now, what happens next, I'm going to do my best. And again, I'm very open to suggestions. Help me out. But it seems like the women are told by the angel, go and tell his followers that Jesus is risen from the dead. And so the women separate. Mary Magdalene seems to go off by herself. Maybe she didn't stay for the whole speech and she's too excited, so she runs off. And the other women run a different path. Something has happened that separates them, because Jesus first meets that group of women and he tells that group, rejoice, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. And so the women go and tell Jesus' followers. Let me tell you something. This is not an accident that Jesus spoke to women and that these women get to be the first gospel evangelists. Now, I know that word might carry some baggage with it in our modern times about who gets to be an evangelist. You know what an evangelist is? It's the bringer of good news.